All right, we're ready to get started? So this talks about lessons learned implementing ChatOps, DevOps plus messaging at large enterprises. So my name is Corey Hulen. I'm co-founder and CTO of Mattermost. I'll talk a little bit more about what Mattermost is in a second. What is ChatOps? So how many people run ChatOps today in their organizations? Okay, well, maybe this will be a good talk. This is more aimed at sort of beginners, sort of like how to, but so this is one of the definitions of ChatOps. There's many of them. This is the one I like. So ChatOps is a collaborative, conversation-centric way of working that brings people, discussions, bots, tools, and files into one central location. So that's all it really is, right? It's nothing fancy. It's more, you'll hear me say it, it's more a methodology than a technology. So that's kind of what it is. Benefits of ChatOps. So why do it, right? These are some of the benefits that we see time and time again, right? It shortens the feedback loop, right? Faster response time. It probably jumps down to this one as one of the most important ones to see. Like, mean time to restore drops dramatically. We see this time and time again. Customers who use ChatOps, getting everyone in the same channel, getting that shared feedback loop is what really drops response times. It's a shared console or command line. So getting everyone in the same channel is a great experience of seeing kind of what the history is, what's been going on in that channel. It captures the history, right? And sort of all the required people in one place, right? So this is a great way to bring everyone together to be focusing on the problem, right? And sort of the last line again, it's a methodology, not a technology. So you'll hear there's a lot of different viewpoints on what ChatOps is. But for me, it's more about the methodology than the technology. It's about bringing all these people together. It's about having that shared experience. It's about capturing the history of what's going on so everyone can kind of see what's going on in a channel, especially in channel-based communication. So you'll kind of see this as like a classic diagram of what ChatOps is. So I'll walk you through these pieces and kind of describe them. The first is you just have your team all the way over here on the left, right? So this is your SREs, your support, your DevOps, your engineers, right? And they're interacting with a messaging tool. So in this case, it's Mattermost. So Mattermost is an open source messaging platform for high trust organizations. There's a lot of other great messaging platforms out there, but you can kind of plug in whichever one you want. But this is us. And basically what the key here is channel-based communication, right? Communication where you have, communication where it's focused on a central topic, around a central topic, right? So you're interacting with this messaging-based application. That messaging-based application is then interacting typically with a bot. So that's the most classic world of ChatOps. You just see it described as bots, right? It can be a lot less than bots, and I'll kind of go through I call it like a 6-step process for getting there. But typically you'll see something like Hugh Bot, where you're giving it sort of maybe natural language queries. It's bringing you back data, and you're sort of exploring your internal systems that way. And then you have something like Hugh Bot or a bot, or different infrastructure, or different, slash commands talking to your infrastructure, right? So this is pulling graphs out of Prometheus or Grafana, pulling data out of MySQL or Kubernetes or AWS or whatever you use, right? So this is just your classic infrastructure. It's about surfacing that information in your infrastructure in a messaging tool that a lot of people have access to, right? So that's kind of the idea, and I even write down here, reality, most are not this sophisticated. Like even the simple steps can help you a long ways in the ChatOps world. So this is great, but how do we get there, right? So step one, this is what we kind of recommend to clients or customers, right? Start small. Do it manually for a bit, right? So the first kind of classic one is, are you a chat-based organization, right? And not everyone is, but if you're not, then get everyone in a sort of a channel-based sort of messaging system. That's kind of step one, right? Start by getting all the humans into the channel, right? That's kind of key. Channel-based communication is key to incident response, right? So you want those channels that are focused on topics. They may be different topics, security, performance, infrastructure, who knows? But you want those conversations to happen around those topics. So the key is just getting your people there and having those conversations, right? Remember, it's a shared thing, right? Think of it like a cooperative board game. I kind of like to think of it in terms of your team has a lot of esoteric knowledge, right? People know how to answer questions. They're like, hey, I think I know the answer to this. And getting them in that sort of channel-based communication, that's step one, is just getting your cooperative team playing together, right? They're playing in that channel, they're seeing the history of what people have done and exploring new ways to start, right? So it captures the history, and that's a very valuable thing, right? Because somebody coming in can join the channel or come in partway through the conversation, see all the previous steps the DevOps engineer did. Hey, did you try this? Oh yeah, I tried that. Look here, here's the results, right? I always like to tell people, don't be afraid to over-add people in the beginning, right? It's better, as long as your people have clearance or security, whatever it is, to see the information, like, it's always better to over-add. It's better to have more eyeballs, because people will self-filter. They'll like, this incident is not important to me. I'm going to ignore it, right? It's not in a component I control or care about. They'll add to the conversation if they can, meaning, hey, I've seen that error message before. I think it might be this, right? So that's just kind of step one. And like I said, it's a very manual process, right? Just getting all your people together in a single channel, right? Based around whatever incident may be. So here's an example. So here's a real world example. So I'm taking a lot of our examples from our community server. So we're an open source product. So we kind of showcase a lot of these different examples in our product itself. It's just community.mattermost.com. Anybody can join it and kind of see the different examples here. These are all real world examples, some better than others. But here's an example of just a manual process of cooperative solving a problem, right? Somebody says, hey, so there's a previous message where somebody just throws a screenshot in, which is a great way to communicate. But you can see one of my teammates asking a community member, like, hey, the screenshot really doesn't help. Can you attach the log for me as well, or a part of the log, right? And so that's what he's doing here. He's attaching the log to the channel. I think this might be in a help wanted or contributors channel where someone's asking for help. But you can see it's a lot more richly formatted information as part of that channel. And please feel free to interrupt or ask questions as I go through this. So that's just kind of step one, right? You're getting people into a rich messaging system that allows you the flexibility to format information and see it in a way that's valuable to your team members. That's kind of what I describe as step one. Very manual, just kind of do it all based on humans. Step two, you automate the simple things. So this is where you start seeing the sort of ChatOps world come into play, right? You don't need to start with the uber powerful bot. Everyone thinks that ChatOps are these amazing, amazing, human interface bots that go off and do all this magical stuff. But it doesn't have to be that, right? It can be just automate the simple alerts, piping them into a channel, right? We see this time and time again. The other thing is to sort of start creating specific channels for different alerts, right? Whether that be security, performance, build systems, or war rooms, right? So it's about making sure you're getting the topics correct and then piping data into those topics, right? And you can get started just by using simple webhooks, right? So most messaging systems in this web space offer things like simple webhooks to get this stuff done. So, and then watch your team cooperatively respond. Like, how often does the left hand not know what the right hand's doing in an organization, right? We see this all the time in our community. I know large enterprises see this all the time, especially when you start talking about things that are going on in your infrastructure. Half the team gets an email alert. The other half the team who caused the alert doesn't actually get it, so they don't even know what's going on, right? So this is about bringing everyone together sort of in that central channel. And so here's a great example. Here's a real world example of us, my internal team, causing a problem with our corporate LDAP server. So we get an alert in one of our channels, right? And one of our team members is there, and we're in all time zones, so we have team members around the world at different times joining. And the first thing he does is he notices it, like, oh, this is related to LDAP. I should, @message Martin to see if he's aware of this, right? Martin's not actually in this channel, so he quickly gets added to the channel. And then you can say, like, oh yeah, I'm doing a lot of requests right now. So he's actually running a load test against one of our corporate LDAP systems, right? So this is just a very simple webhook where an alert gets posted into a channel. You have the certain number of team members, and they're monitoring the channel, but can easily go grab other team members and bring them in, right? So maybe the very simple form of ChatOps. Some people may not call this ChatOps, I do, but it's just the very simplest form of, you have an alert, let's get the right people in the room to respond to that alert and let's see what's going on. So a very simple example, but a very sort of necessary step in the process. Any questions or, no? Okay. Step two, so automate the harder things, right? You can start by adding advanced slash commands or alerting hooks. You can bring in richer data, and I'll kind of go through examples here. So what I mean by harder things that are more than screenshots, right? It's always better to start adding more and more rich data. So you start off with a very manual process. You start off with some alerts and webhooks, some very simple things, and then you start very quickly wanting, your users start very quickly wanting more, right? So you start adding more than screenshots. You start adding things like markdown tables, file attachments for logs, right? Markdown formatting. So there's a whole slew of these different types of things, but it's about getting the users who don't necessarily have, like a great example is how many times do you have your DevOps or SRE side have access to a bunch of metrics that your engineers don't, right? They're just not in the right emails, they're not in the right systems to actually easily bring that information back, right? So it's about bringing that information out for them into a semi-public space and giving them a rich version of it, right? So I'll walk through a couple different examples. So here's an example of a load test result, right? So somebody issued a slash command. That slash command actually went off into our CI/CD pipeline, spun up a load test because someone requested a load test, all from within chat, right? It's not like they're in some super secret system. They just went, slash matter build, load test, blah, 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 right? And it runs off. Our CI/CD pipeline gets kicked off. It starts running a particular load test. It starts running this particular load test. It may take 5, 10, 15 minutes to run. And at the end of that load test, the results get posted back into the channel, right? And so here's just an example of sort of, richly formatting the information so it's easy for users to see, right? So this is kind of taking it to the next step, right? Start leveraging the tools in your chat system that allow you to really quickly disseminate information to your team, right? So that's one example of sort of rich markdown being rendered. Here's an example of rich message, a log being attached, right? So this is a little bit more manual, but we do have automated systems that do this as well. So here's an example where someone created a bug. It's actually from the Jira bot, and it kind of links to Jira, but it kind of explains some of the repo steps, but it's missing some key pieces of information, right? Like the logs for that. So here's an example of me attaching the Nginx logs, right? And it's actually a text file, but when you click it, you can just see the logs right there in place, and you can start scrolling through and searching for it. So here's a great example where you're having an incident or a bug, you're having a team discussing it, and you just want more information around that, right? More rich information. Remember, the more rich information you can bring into this experience, the more your people will use this experience, more they will depend on it, and you're also talking about largely disseminating this information to a big group of people, right? Here's an example where I'm attaching a very specific thing in Nginx logs, right? But some members of my team have a lot of amazing Nginx experience, way more than I do, right? And they'll be able to look through these logs and quickly identify like, hey, this is where I think the problem is, right? Yeah.
There's a question asking stuff. So are you tracking at all what we're doing in the FTC3 working group program?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
In the FTC3 world, I look at that and I go, well, that's a context log file, and actually you've got a log viewer which looks pretty pedestrian. And what would be neat and you'd be able to achieve with stuff we're doing in FTC3 is to say, anybody could then say, actually, I can show a log viewer. And then when you clicked it, instead of bringing up your viewer, they could bring up their super duper viewer. And this kind of auto-discovery of services that are available on a particular user thing is what we're doing in FTC3. So it might be something you want to kind of come across to.
Yeah, and we should talk. And I'll show something in step 5 that maybe will pique your interest. Any other questions about this? No? Okay. Steps 3. So this is start automating command and control, right? So start off with simple things, simple outgoing webhooks, simple slash commands, right? And the key here is you automate things that you find your teammates constantly bugging your DevOps team to go give them reports for or do, right? Everyone in an organization knows this. Some email gets sent off into some random, or chat message gets sent off into some random ether asking somebody like, hey, can you give me this report? And then 3 days later, right? Or the logs for this, right? If it's critical issue, it'll come back faster, hopefully. But if it's non-critical, 3 days later, you finally get someone responding to it, right? So this is about taking simple things like slash commands, automating it, and letting your users self-provision, right? So this is kind of like the next step. So that's the key here, right? Allow self-provisioning by most anyone, or most anyone who has access to that kind of data, right? So they can go query the system through this common messaging interface, right? And that's kind of the one of the keys. Everyone in the same channel again, everyone seeing the command and control. And what's cool about this is someone issuing the command and control, or let's say pulling back a report, like just bringing back analytics is the first step, right? Other people will get to see that too, right? They'll go in and they'll see me, what queries I'm running and what data I'm trying to get at, right? And then they will either, hey, tell me like, hey, you should be running this query instead, it's probably better, right? Or they'll come in and do it themselves, right? And then the key here is, you trust the automation to keep them on the rails, right? They shouldn't be able to screw this up, right? You have a very narrow sort of /command interface that's very robust and idempotent, right? And it can run the same command, it cannot really affect your infrastructure much, it brings back the data into the channel, right? And you're allowing all your people to see this and have this happen. And the cool, interesting thing about this when you start doing this is you'll start seeing non-developers run these commands, right? You'll see your developers in running these commands. Then I say non-developers, like I mean people more like first tier support or maybe QA person, right? Who's not necessarily very familiar with what's going on, but they know enough, like, hey, they're going to eventually want this information, or I know if I see this error, I think I've seen this before. Let me run this command, right? So now you're really empowering your organization, right? You're empowering people who would have never done this before to self-discover this information, right? And that's one of the keys, right? You're starting to grow these command and control hooks outside that core nucleus of people who, quote, know what they're doing, even though half the time we don't know what we're doing, right? And the key there is just trusting the automation and trusting the automation to keep them on the rails, right? So some examples of these things that can be very complex or very easy depending on your environment that we use this step for is we'll set up automated testing or ad hoc testing. So if a QA person wants a server, they can go in and issue a / command that actually provisions the server, sets it all up correctly. They can even tell like MySQL versus Postgres, whatever it is. It'll queue the server, it'll fire it up, it'll post back in the channel like, hey, here's access to your test server. Set up load testing environments. You saw an example earlier of us doing this. Or query details, right? Querying details on analytics system. That's always interesting, right? Most people want to get in there, and then they have an incident or something going on, they want to start pulling out information and piping that into the channel, and that's kind of key. And then last, you start automating deployments to production, right? And why would you do this? I think one of the keys is, it's nice to see history of what went wrong, right? When someone's issuing / commands, that then go out and talk to Jenkins or one of your CI/CD pipelines, right? You have a very rich history of what that person was doing, right? You have this shared deploy experience where anyone can kind of come in and troubleshoot very quickly, like, hey, what's the problem with this? Why didn't this deploy correctly? So that's step 3. So I'll show some really quick examples. We have something called Matter build. It actually cuts our release builds. So you can kind of see here, he's issuing a / command. To cut the build, it echoes back saying like, okay, I'm gonna immediately echo back in the channel like, yes, I'm cutting the build for you. It actually posts in the other channel. That's what this message is down here. Like, hey, Carlos is starting a build or whatever, or Matter build is starting a build or whatever. It goes off. We go into our CI/CD pipeline. The build starts running. It, let's say, completes in 20 minutes, and assuming a successful build. So here's an example of us building a release candidate. The information for that release candidate is actually echoed back into the channel for everyone to see, right? So our testers can go start seeing it. A bunch of our systems will actually already have this version installed, right? But here's sort of the release details for that RC candidate. Here's the build links, here's the hashes if you want to go fooling around with it, install it yourself. Here's a testing server that's already set up with it, all that kind of information. So you can kind of see from a very simple standpoint of being able to cut a build, a release build, and get it to a point where the entire team quickly knows what's going on. So here's an example of our / command. Here's the help for it. If you notice, it can do a whole bunch of other stuff. It can cut builds. It can do some. It helps you with the branching for things like our poodle translations. It can do load tests. You can actually merge branches. You can run certain types of jobs. You can see the configuration of the build system here. You can even see configuration of our individual servers. And so And this is kind of the next step, right? You're talking about building slash commands and slash commands that have a lot of information so people can discover what these things do, right? And the key is making sure these slash commands are kind of bulletproof, or you know, in the sense that if you run it and you run it improperly, you don't have to worry about it screwing up your infrastructure. And so this leads us to sort of the next step, right? And this is where you see the bots start coming into play. So you're taking all that previous steps, right? Going from the manual to the simple alerts to the slash commands, and now you're really starting to talk about turning it more into a bot-style interface, right? Really letting it go out to the masses and allowing them to query this, because who can remember the cryptic slash command without looking at the help? I can't even do it, right? So this is about allowing your bots to sort of take over this infrastructure and give you interesting information about it, right? So you take all the previous steps and you start converting them into a more human interface. So that's kind of key. I always like to tell people, you know, give your bot some character, make it fun, right? Make it angry, make it overly happy. The key here is to humanize it for your audience, right? And part of that humanization, or that character that your bot has, it draws people in to want to use it, want to experience it, right? And it gives you something to blame in the end, right? The angry bot did it, not me, right? So it's a great way to help you blame your infrastructure instead of blaming people. And there's a lot of great existing bot interfaces out there. So Hugh Bot's a great example. You hear people talk a lot about it. It already has a bunch of plugins that are able to connect to and build different things. Hugh Bot's a great example for connecting to things like Jenkins, you know, showing servers logs for various test servers, showing Grafana reports, right? A rich human interface into those existing systems you may have, right? So here's a very simple of a Hugh Bot. We don't have a whole lot that we can show or that are worth showing, but you know, here's just me saying, "Hey, Hugh Bot, let's ship it." It's a very human interface. It comes back with, you know, the classic ship it squirrel. Hugh Bot. I mean, we've seen people who have Hugh Bot do a lot of really interesting stuff, and this is where you want to start getting to as a larger organization. And this kind of brings me to step 5. I call this an optional step, so this might be something interesting. And this is where you start building rich plugins and bots. So, you know, utilizing a rich plugin framework to build deep integration widgets. So this is something that Mattermost supports. Other chat systems may or may not support this, but it's something, when you start talking about wanting to really leverage very specific applications in your infrastructure, part of that is about embedding those applications in something like chat where your users sit, right? Or vice versa, right? Embedding chat in those applications. So to me, this is kind of one of those interesting steps where you start building really rich integrations, right? You can do both front-end and back-end plugins. In Mattermost, you can even intercept messages before they're entered into the chat system. And you can also intercept them afterwards, right? So you can think of really unique cases that you can do with your bots and your plugins. And so I'll kind of show the ones that we have running in our system. So we have a GitHub integration in our system. And if you notice, it's kind of really interesting. There's actually this GitHub bot right here. This is actually my account. It's telling me I have one unread message in this pull request. So it'll notify me when something changes in GitHub, and it tells me like, hey, Corey, you need to go look at this. Now, one of the other cool things here is you can see this really rich integration right here. So this is the actual GitHub plugin that we produce actually taking control of the left-hand side, right? So it's taking control of that little team sidebar widget. So I'm not sure, you know, if people are familiar with, you know, other chat apps like Slack or whatever, but you can imagine being able to take control over pieces of the UI, right? And this starts really interesting, right? Because it gives me all these other things I can do in GitHub. I can see my open pull requests, which I have none, my open forks, open items, my unread messages, stuff like that. So it's a very rich integration with my chat app, right? So that's one example of what I mean by rich integration. Here's another one where it's kind of the same thing. So this is actually a popover. So when I click on Elias's name, this is actually a pop-up. This is another place we allow you to do a plugin. And if you notice, it actually linked in, it was smart enough to link in his GitHub profile, right? So from right there, I can kind of find a user, I can find his profile. I can do interesting stuff like that. And probably the last one is you can actually take control of the entire center pane. So this is kind of maybe more to your example of like logs or whatever, where you know, here's something being discussed. I can immediately come in here and say create Jira issue, right? So I added this action button there, right, to the message. And when I click it, I can get a very rich pop-up, right? So a rich pop-up of creating that ticket in the system, right? So this is about bridging between where bots or human interface can get you so far and taking you something more multimodal, where having that sort of rich, deep integration with exterior apps. You can even open up windows into other things. Takes you so much further, right? So you're actually still in Mattermost here, but you're actually going to end up creating a ticket in Jira. And it was smart enough to actually copy over the entire threaded conversation for this ticket here, right? So I can really quickly, in a rich style interface, create a ticket in Jira. And this is where we see customers being very successful when they start taking a lot of their sort of discovery and command and control of the bots and integrating that with really rich integrations into their chat system, right? Keeping everyone in the same place, because what's kind of cool about this is after I finish creating the ticket, the person who posts that message will see the message right in line, right? Corey created this ticket in Jira to track this issue, right? So that's something that becomes super interesting. And then sort of step 6 is what I call Nirvana. So this is bots talking to bots. This is sort of your bot Nirvana in the end. We see some of our customers generating more than 50% of their traffic from bots. So we see some customers doing more than 1 million messages a day. And that means 500,000 of those messages are actually just coming from bots in their infrastructure. It's a very amazing number, and it's a very cool thing to see. And so what are they doing with this many bots, right? They do a lot of different things, but some of the funnest ones to talk about are things like some customers have a war room, right? And the war room during an outage has so many messages going by, more than 20 a second, a human cannot actually read the war room, right? And it's kind of funny at that point. I describe it as reading the Matrix, right? All these messages going by, I'm like, that's great. That doesn't give me any value, right? But where the value is some of these customers actually have bots watching that war room, right? And it's almost like an app backplane, right, at that point. They have bots that are watching that war room, pulling out certain messages, putting them into channels where humans can interact with those messages and that data, right? And then they have bots that are pushing those messages back into channels, back into that war room channel, right? So at that point, it's acting almost like a message bus, right? And you've kind of reached this bot nirvana, where bots are almost talking to bots in lots of respects. And that's where you get into a really interesting infrastructure. And we can kind of go into more detail from here, but you start talking about bots having the ability to self-heal or recognize certain problems. Because remember, most of these large enterprises are very decentralized microservices organizations, right? The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, or this microservice doesn't really know what this other microservice is doing, right? So there's a common sort of message bus for these microservices to talk together, right? And using a channel in Mattermost to do this, or in a chat-based application. And the key there is you have humans and bots sort of talking in human style talk, right? And that's what's key, because you're pulling those messages out, you're augmenting it, right? It's semi-structured data, you're augmenting it with human facts, and then you're putting those messages back in. So that's always a fun one to talk about and see. I think we might end a little early, which might be good. Questions?
There's, I don't know, let's say you have a QA channel.
Yep.
Your QA people on it. You may want certain QA people to be able to /restart the server, but other ones to be able to /deploy. Is there permissioning for /command, or how do you?
Yeah, so there is. So we actually have that. So if you actually go in our community server today and you try to do Mattermost /cut build, obviously we don't want 3,000 people in our community to be able to cut a release build, right? So we actually have permissions based on different things, such as /commands. And so in our system you can. So some of those commands are available to a lot of people. Like I think almost anyone can actually run a load test in our system. Any community member of the 3,000 people can just go /load test Mattermost, right? But for things like cutting a release build, only certain people we give permissions to. And it'll actually echo back and tell you, sorry, you don't have the proper permissions. Go talk to blah, 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 right?
You talked about being able to intercept the messages before they hit the chat. And you're in an interesting position because you write the chat service.
Yep.
Have you thought about extending the bot framework so they actually have a kind of intelligence command line? Because that's one of the main criticisms about this kind of decentralized command line.
Yeah, no, so exactly that, right? Being able to echo back IntelliSense and know what the person is doing. So we allow you to post back ephemeral messages. So you can actually intercept that message and make a decision before it goes into the system. So it can go into a system record in the system, stored permanently, whatever, forever, for all eternity until you delete it, right? Or you can actually say, hey, I'm going to reject this message, but you can reject it in several ways. You can reject it back with an ephemeral message. So you can actually give the user guidance like, sorry, you actually inputted that flash command incorrectly. You know, the second parameter should have something to do with blah, 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 or whatever, right? So we allow you to do that as well. And we allow you to intercept it after the message. And so you run into all these really interesting use cases where you want to reformat messages. And we see this all the time, right? We see this all the time, and we see this as real-world use cases where human users input data that's semi-structured, and the pre-message hook actually understands that data. So think of it like detecting a stock ticker or an IP address, right? And then it does a whole bunch of magical linking after the fact. So you get a very rich representation, and we see this all the time in InfoSec. Security is a great example, right? Oh, we're getting an issue from this IP address, right? Or this domain, right? And you want to link it, you want to auto-create a link into your very rich, you know, security analysis tool around that IP address, right? That's actually a real-world use case that we see, something like that quite a bit. And so the ability to intercept that message before is really interesting. And think of it in terms of things like passwords or security keys or social security numbers, right? Hey, if it begins with, you know, private key, let's maybe reject that message from the server, right? Just because we don't want it to be a system of record for all time, right? So there's a lot of things we find customers doing like that as well, right? Which is, hey, you can detect social, you know, things that look like a social security number, don't let it go into the chat, right? And same thing for other chat bots, right? When you have a chat bot that's just blindly posting stuff in, you can have another plugin that's reading that chat bot, and before it goes in the system of record is reformatting it, right? So it knows that even though this is coming from a very rich security analytics tool, you may not want to show that all that information to all of your users, right? So it reformats the message into something that's more general audience available. Any other questions?
Have you ever came to a problem, because we support some channels as well, where like half conversation is on a GitHub issue and half of it is on a thread on your conversation in ChatOps. Now, how do you solve that?
Yeah, that's a good one. We see that quite a bit. One of the things that we do is, like take Jira for example. Our actual Jira plugin one, we'll try to keep the messages in sync. So if you post to that, if you post in that, let's say Jira comment on the Jira ticket, it'll actually post it back in the channel as part of the thread. So a lot of our bots or plugins, we strive for sort of two-way communication to keep those things in sync, or at least a very quick access, right? So it's like, hey, new information was entered, go here to see it, or whatever. So we do see that some of the bots or plugins do it a lot better than others, but that is an area we're going towards, is the ability to sort of that bi-directional communication, because that's the reality of it, right? How many people, like, we even see this in our organization, right? How many, you know, not every developer has access to Zendesk to see the actual customer support ticket, right? That's a huge pain, right? I have a very expensive DevOps resource who's looking over the issue, but he doesn't have access to all the information, right? Or same thing with Jira, right? We have a community member who is helping, you know, troubleshoot a bug, and he wants access to all the information in Jira, right? So we see that quite a bit. And so a lot of times we're trying to build these bidirectional plugins or bots. Other questions? Yep.
It's a bit of a newbie question.
Yep.
When you start to write bots, is there a framework, maybe it's Hugh Bot, I'm not sure, is there a framework where you can basically write the logic of your bot in a way that's agnostic to the chat platform?
Yes. So that's exactly what Hugh Bot is. There's a lot of them out there. You can Google them. Hugh Bot's probably the one that I see the most. But it's kind of language agnostic. It's kind of platform agnostic. It works with a bunch of different chat platforms. It works with a bunch of different languages. It already has a bunch of sort of back-end integrations that already knows how to control things like Jira and stuff like that. So that's probably the best starting point. But there's a lot of them out there. So there's a lot of good ones out there as well.
And is there, because the use case, we use Symphony and UBS, and people start to get excited about writing bots for it, but MS Teams or whatever else is just over the horizon. So I'm concerned about binding too tightly to any one platform.
And that's the nice aspect of doing that. So that's one of the big reasons for doing this in a bot-style interface, right? That human-style conversation is what allows you to sort of create that loose coupling, right? And that's a great first step. Yeah, that's a great first step. What we find is sort of that second step where you want really rich integrations, right? And that because you want those people to have access to more information at some point. But yeah, it's a great, that human language interface is a great lowest common denominator, right? And it's very powerful. You can do a lot. Other questions? No? All right, I think we're about perfect on time. Thanks for coming.